It doesn't get too loud in here.
Thanks everyone for joining. We'll start in about 30 seconds, if that.
It doesn't get too loud.
Matt, my screen look okay?
Sure does.
All right. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Erica Mixon. I'm Content Marketing Manager here at Blumira. Today we're talking about the Log4Shell alternative trigger. This is a discovery that Matt here made last week. If you were in our webinar about the Log4Shell vulnerability last week, he actually kind of came up with it during that webinar. And then confirmed it later on. And now this is something that pretty significantly expands the attack surface of Log4j and is pretty relevant to a lot of organizations. We came out with a blog post about it on Friday, kind of explaining that and giving a technical analysis, but we wanted to give some more context to this issue and give you the chance to ask any questions to Matt. So here we are going to discuss that today, and we're looking forward to getting your questions and answering your questions. So thank you so much for joining us. And Matt, welcome. Matt is
Hello.
a frequent guest on Blumira webinars, and we're very lucky to have him. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, me too. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am Matt Warner. I am the CTO and Co-Founder of Blumira. My background is in software engineering as well as defensive and offensive security. Blumira came from us wanting to develop a SIEM, a log aggregation platform that was more accessible and more scalable for everyone in the environment, especially SMBs. And one of the benefits of that is that we see large sets of data across a bunch of different types of organizations that aren't necessarily big organizations with big operationalized stuff. And that's part of where all this was derived from.
Excellent. Well, we're lucky to have you on here, and we're looking forward to your insights. So thank you so much. So just so everyone knows, we will have a question and answer period at the end. So feel free to, chat with us, put your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them in a timely manner, but we will save all questions toward the end, just so Matt has the opportunity to go through some slides and explain his point of view here. All right, Matt. So like I was saying on that webinar was kind of when you discovered that attack vector for Log4j. Let's take a step back briefly. And I'm sure everyone on this webinar probably knows about the Log4j vulnerability, but is there any way that you can just give a brief overview of what has been going on here? Because I know there's been a lot to keep track of recently.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, we're going to call it Log4j instead of Log4j, but we could call it Log4j, whatever tickles your fancy.
Missed opportunity for a poll right there.
I know, yeah, exactly. So in regard to where Log4j has come, Log4j, as of pretty sure 2013, included a lookup function that allowed essentially a call to be added into those logs that was, when it was added, used to decorate the logs with actually like host name details and details from the host and other useful pieces of information into that. As of a couple of week ago now, week and 10 days, however long it's been, a POC was dropped onto Twitter, essentially indicating that you could use that JNDI lookup inside of Log4j to execute commands out to the internet to then bring down a malicious class into your Java environment. That it kind of grew over the next few days. It grew from, oh, look at that LDAP one to, oh yeah, we could use RMI, HTTP. We could expand this out even further. We could obfuscate this call even further. And it kind of grew, as we all now know, over the last weekish of time. As we were going through that process at Blumira, as we were going through our remediation and detection efforts at Blumira as well, it came to, how else could we exploit this? How else could attackers start to leverage this kind of environment? As those of you who've done research in regard to actual exploitation of Log4j, it differs highly. It depends really highly on how that actual application functions, how it logs out information, how they're leveraging Log4j, and what information is kind of passing through that logger inside of that environment. And that we'll talk about that a little bit more in general. So if you go and you look up PoCs for like VMware as it pertains to how to execute the RCE against it, it's not complex necessarily, but it's a number of steps you have to take to actually execute the Log4j exploit against it. What this conversation is really about is how much risk is Log4j and the JNDI and not updating Log4j exploit really exposing as it pertains to development machines, as it pertains to out-of-date machines, as it pertains to kind of your casually utilizing Log4j or very expansive configurations on those hosts, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. In regard to this specific thing, WebSocket connections have always been interesting to me. For those of you who don't look at your WebSockets really closely or don't look at like sysmon data and how it's connecting out, it is a situation where we're starting to see more defensive utilization of WebSockets more over the last few years, where people will leverage them to say, all right, I'm going to try to connect to every, let's say, top 100 port on this local host, and I'm going to know if a port is open based on the timing, because a WebSocket won't be able to connect. And I've had this question a few times, so I'm going to make sure I start with this here. If there's not a WebSocket that's properly doing the callback, the WebSocket's never going to fully connect. So a WebSocket is going to open that connection, and on open, it's going to be able to send a message and receive a message. And what we're talking about here, and when these hosts are using this technique to do scanning, they aren't looking to actually fully connect to that port. They're looking to see if you can actually open a connection to that port, and if it's going to hang. Like, is it going to be able to connect and sit there? Because in that case, you can identify if that host has RDP open, you can identify if SMB is open, you can identify what's open in that host really, really easily. And you can do that for every visitor. It does not really require much effort. One of the areas that we saw this most recently was when we were deploying out some detections looking for kind of like mass scanning from a host inside of itself. And what these detections, these host fingerprinting will do is essentially trigger these large scan events inside of that host. So generally speaking, while it's largely used for chatting, it's used for alerts, it's used for that back and forth kind of WebSocket communication. Because WebSockets are pretty new, the RFC, I think, is 11 years old at this point. There isn't a lot of inherent security built into WebSockets at this point. They just kind of go. You tell it to go, and locally that browser says, great, you told me to do this thing, I'm going to go. There isn't a concept of like origin security. The browser's like, nope, this site says you can only connect to this, like for HTTP calls. Therefore, you can't make this call. WebSockets don't care. It isn't relevant to them. You ask them to make that connection, and they're going to try one way or another to make that connection. And that kind of inherently puts everyone into a situation where not only is anyone, when you go to a website, able to figure out what ports are available, but they're also able to make a get to anywhere in your local environment. And they can make a number of gets. It doesn't matter, because that host is still going to take that get.
Now, are there any particular browsers that have better security against WebSockets, or is it just kind of a free-for-all no matter what browser you use?
It's in the situation that we're talking about here, it's really generally a free-for-all. There's some differentiation as it pertains to WebSocket utilization for secure calls, if I recall correctly. And there are some ways that you can leverage like Node to compile down like WebSocket libraries to give you a bit more control of WebSockets. But generally speaking, as it pertains to what we're talking about here, just kind of firing a get out and forcing that host to at least process that get, that's what we saw. And that's really where the main concern comes from in return, and as it pertains to Log4j, or really any sort of simple exploitation that could occur inside of that environment. Because you could use this for egress detection as well. Like, there's nothing stopping you from firing a WebSocket connection that says, all right, I want to force this host to try to connect out from its host out to a bunch of different ports. And you could easily identify what ports are open on that host at that point, for example.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this process is this attack vector is pretty scary when you think about it, because it can open up to pretty much anyone browsing the internet, which is certainly a scary thing. Can you kind of take us through your thought process behind discovering this, Matt? Like, what was it like to test this in the lab, and what was kind of going through your mind as you created this POC?
Sure, yeah. So we had already built a POC for JNDI exploiting over the X API version, which is similar to a Tomcat vulnerability for JNDI, and that worked out fine. A lot of us have tested that, I think. We did it inside of Spring Framework, which worked out well in our testing. A few of the things we learned was that the exploit itself can be somewhat finicky. I mean, you're loading it into a JVM. You need the exploit of the malicious Java class to land properly. So you do have a few hitches. The attackers have a few hitches. It's not a guaranteed exploit on every host. There is work that has to be done. There's loader work that has to be done. However, what we really learned was that there are a lot of really good JNDI exploit kits out there already, because the JNDI exploit method has been around for a number of years now, and this allowed attackers to really quickly and easily leverage those exploit kits. We saw the first usage of the JNDI exploit kit, which is now deleted on GitHub, within about I think it was 19 hours from the initial POC. It might have been a little less than that. So it went really fast. But as it pertains to this WebSocket POC, what we did is we wanted to see what would happen if you pass. So what can you pass and what can you do from a WebSocket is really the first big question. And you can do 2 or 3 things. You can execute a get and you can control that path. You can control that path and the parameters associated with that path. You can control the origin of that call. You can't necessarily control the headers, but origin is written in the header, and you can control the protocols associated with that to an extent as well, or protocols, quote unquote. It's more of a declaration of protocols more than it is actually leveraged. And depending on how that host logs out those requests, which is where I said earlier of like how verbose the logging is associated with that host, you can really quickly and easily drop malicious strings into these hosts and very quickly and easily get an attack to land and call back out to you. The example on the right there was a Spring Boot server that was essentially logging out the params as well as the get, as you can see. This is a pretty robust thing that you would log out. Probably a better example would be like if you were logging out every request to your Elasticsearch server, or you were logging out exceptions to your Elasticsearch server, or you were logging out requests to your Tomcat server. Like those kind of things start to, if you were using Log4j, those kind of environments start to or Spring Boot, put the environment at risk, because you are running basically a environment that puts you into a place where you can be exploited by just visiting a website. And the modeling that we used internally as we were thinking about this was local Java developers running services locally that aren't exposed anywhere to the internet, that were perhaps out of date, but they were working on them locally. Like I think a lot of us as engineers do. We work on stuff locally. We have it listening locally. We're doing our testing internally, but we don't really think about how it's exposed, generally speaking. And all that would have to be required would be to lure that person to somewhere. It doesn't have to be an obviously malicious site. You could use malvertising. You could inject commands somewhere. You just need that JavaScript to connect locally. And all you need to do at that point is then essentially make sure that WebSocket will then connect, as you can see in some of these calls. It'll make the call into that environment. And at that point, it would exploit the JNDI issue with lookups, go out to the attacking server, which still has its own ways to mitigate through egress, of course, which you can talk a little bit more about as well, and then exploit that victim's host with really no clear, obvious situation that did happen. You could, of course, move laterally. There's nothing stopping WebSockets from touching your entire internal environment. Like I could run a port scan on an entire /24 in your environment inside of your browser WebSockets, on you just visiting a site, and do it by measuring the ports that you have open across to that by time, how long it took to open and close, if it was refused, that kind of thing. And you'd be able to get pretty broad intelligence into what's happening inside of that environment. This is similar in that we're basically saying, if there was a user, which there are a lot of users out there, a Java developer who's working in Java, had a server listening on 8080, it was in debug mode because you were wanting to kind of get all the information out you could, it would be quick and easy just to have them going to a website, easily trigger this vulnerability. And in this case, this was a local REST API, which then logged out that information, which then triggered that vulnerability with them going out to the internet to get the malicious class, bring it back down and exploit that host. This is probably a bigger issue when you think about larger organizations with expansive Java developing groups who are working on perhaps a lot of different REST APIs or a lot of different websites, and they have things listening locally, and maybe they're using Log4j because they standardized on it. Those environments that have not yet been updated because they're thinking like, well, they're local, we don't need to do this. Those are the ones that I'm concerned about as it pertains to this attack. We discovered this just before 2.15 came out. And one of the reasons that we didn't publish it at that point was because 2.15 was supposed to be a localhost restriction. So you could only execute a JNDI lookup if you were calling from the localhost. And this basically threw that out the window at that point because you were making a localhost request inside of those logs, potentially bypassing that localhost bypass that was supposed to be in there. But of course, we now know that there was a whole different bypass that was discovered. You could just put a hash in there, and that then bypasses the localhost bypass anyway. So we released it following that and into the 2.16 release. This is fixed by the 2.17 release. It is theoretically possible to trigger the DOS in the 2.16 release using the same technique, but essentially it is similar to your usual, quote unquote, usual social engineering attack. You're adding someone to a watering hole, you're getting someone to a place that you built a drive-by exploitation for them. And it's a very simple and quiet way to test to see if you can just luckily get an exploit into that environment. And to be an opportunistic factor and just kind of drop this somewhere, it's a really big potential benefit for them to say, well, I mean, worst case, I can stand up javatips.com and I can get 1,000 people to go for it. And if 1,000 of those are Java developers, one of them might be listening on 8080 and one of them might have Log4j listening. So I'm going to try. And at the very least, you can probably get a good amount of information out of their hosts.
And it seems like a relatively easy exploit path for those threat actors. So it's kind of, unfortunately, a no-brainer for them to add that into their arsenal of tools, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're driving someone to some sort of lure, or you know that you can drop command injections across malicious sites, or you know that you can kind of set this up across different places, it's an easy win to say like, well, I'm just going to try 100 ports. And I'm going, well, you need to try that many. I'm going to try 20 ports. I'm going to try to pass the JNDI exploit through params, get, origin, and protocol, and we'll see if any of them resolve. And if any of them do, that's fine. We'll move on to the next set because it is no effort at that point. It's just lucky to an extent, which is not a bad thing. And attackers are very good at leveraging luck into what they want, whereas defenders do not get that benefit of luck as much.
Which is unfortunate. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the explanation there. You had mentioned that this is more difficult for organizations with larger Java environments. Do you have any advice for those folks that might be overwhelmed with how to begin, patching this and approaching this situation? Is there anything that they can do for like maybe a quick win to just say, all right, let's check that off the list?
Well,
that's too much of a stretch. I know that I know that this is kind of a beast to manage for a lot of folks.
Yeah, there are a few good scanners out there for people, and every day people are releasing new scanners to identify where Log4j kind of classes are being used inside of your hosts. If you haven't started to look at those or leverage those, do. It's really important that you identify where Log4j is, and part of it may just be part of your like SDLC process where like, we're going to just review all of our code and tell people they need to update to the latest versions, which is okay, but you want to make sure you identify where this is being used. Look at your Gradle and Maven manifest, determine where you're utilizing those potentially old Log4j versions or where other dependencies are pulling them in. The searching scripts that you search everything, the everything.exe are not bad in our experience. They tend to work out pretty well for the most part. So it's definitely worth identifying and putting that effort into where Log4j is. In the short term, well, you should do this anyways, but in the short term, looking at your egress filtering is going to be a big win for stopping a lot of this. like more than likely, you don't need to go LDAP out to the internet. You don't need to go high ports out to the internet. You don't need to do a lot of things that a lot of the attack vectors are using at this point. They're the only one that might be difficult for some people would be the HTTP one. But in a lot of those situations with HTTP, they are still using high ports going out to collect that malicious Java class. So if you are doing at least moderately strict, and I think if we can get to it, if anyone can get to it, pretty strict egress filtering, you can stop a lot of these attacks from calling back. And then you're just at a point where you're just identifying, well, where are these issues? How can I make sure that people are up to date? Of course, egress filtering starts to go away when you think about your remote workers, when you think about how people are leveraging the exploit itself. It's possible there could be a casual situation where someone gets exploited, and then when they connect back onto their VPN, that they could then move laterally into the environment. In those situations, I know it's never fun for anyone, but looking at your Windows firewall, looking at leveraging NetSH inside of that to reject packets going out to places that would be dangerous. Like most people are not using RMI, generally speaking. Some people are, but you can probably use some pretty heavy egress filtering on RMI, high ports. Most people don't need to go LDAP out to the internet. Like that kind of stuff, your usual endpoints don't need those permissions. Then in those situations, if there's a drive-by exploit or a drive-by compromise, it won't be able to call back out. It won't be able to pull down that malicious Java class, and the machine won't end up being exploited. That's really your best bet for kind of like broadly ensuring that you can have security in your environment as it pertains to this, as you're sorting that out. If you don't write Java, you're probably okay in some cases, but I will throw out there in the previous slide, there was a snapshot of that, screenshot of that as it pertains to I forced this exception out of Elasticsearch, which is, you can see the JNDI string on there. There are ways, and people will continue to develop ways, and this is just a single get. People will continue to develop ways to invoke this JNDI exploit string through Log4j. And this was just me. I turned on exception logging across for query shard exception, as you can see. I turned that on inside of my Elasticsearch, and I basically forced Elasticsearch to log this out. Is this a default setup? No, but it easily could be a setup for you. So it's one of those areas where you're going to see situations where people are doing development work, where people have configured an environment that they need better visibility, that it will result in these odd kind of, I ran into getting exploited. How did that actually happen? And for threat modeling, it's important to think about, well, I need to model this threat to say, if I have Java developers, if I have people leveraging Java, if I have environments that leverage Java, could the attack come from this environment? If so, are there PoCs available that involve a simple get to invoke this kind of environment? And if so, what information do they need to get to it? Because this was just a get across. I think I used a basic like index 1. It wasn't a complex index name to guess, for example. So there's a few kind of hitches that fall into that. But in general, as we get further away from the announcement of Log4j and deeper into this is just the reality of the situation, get updated, which is largely what people are hearing at this point, we're going to see more PoCs get generated that are just like, you could just force this thing to error out. And when it errors out, it prints out the origin of this request. And when it prints out the origin of this request, it also prints the JNDI string. And those kind of things are what we're probably going to see grow more and more, like this exception you see over there to the right. And of course, this exploit is just the start. It's always going to result in, especially these days, you're going to see Cobalt strike. You're going to see other droppers get dropped into that environment. Looking for pivoting from Java to PowerShell, making sure that you're seeing those pivots, making sure you're seeing processes get utilized will always be important as well. People are always going to want to grow this is just a beachhead. This is just them getting started into that environment. They're going to grow at this point. So making sure that you have that host level visibility that allows you to see when they start to grow will also make things a lot easier for you as well.
Mm-hmm. So you're thinking that the longer organizations have running the vulnerable versions of Log4j, the more dangerous it's going to be, right?
Yes, yeah, very much so. We're going to see more PoCs generated. We're going to see more research around how can we invoke this through a single or multiple gets. You can do as many as you want. because the server is still going to take that get, just the WebSocket's not going to negotiate it, which is fine for the attack. And then how else is this going to grow? It's going to grow over time, but we have time right now to get egress filtering in place, get things updated, and start to reduce this modeling of threat against the environment as a whole.
So when it comes to egress filtering, can you explain what that is from a high level perspective, and also describe sort of, do all firewalls come with egress filtering as a feature? How does one go about performing egress filtering?
So when we say egress filtering, or we hear people talk about egress filtering, basically what we're saying is only allow traffic out of your network that should be going out of your network. Generally speaking, you don't need people to, like a thing that we commonly see, and we it's used for exfiltration on and off, is people that allow RDP out. Like maybe they've blocked RDP in, but you can RDP wherever you want out of the environment. And we've seen a number of cases where that alone has allowed an attacker to exfiltrate data out of the environment. So when we say egress filtering, really when you hear from a security people is, hey, let's make sure that we're doing deny all at our firewall. When we're denying all from the firewall, we're going to add in the things that we want to poke holes out in the environment. And we're going to know that at that point, only these certain things will be allowed out. Like we're going to allow 443 out, for example, and nothing else. But only 53 is allowed out from the DC, which is going to provide DNS back to all the other machines. Allowing this kind of like really structured and tiered out least access egress for your environment will allow you to essentially stop the majority of attacks across the environment, just because it results in a situation where you don't need to worry as much about how is this going to fit into my environment? Am I going to make things work? You're going to push people into requesting access out, and you're going to be able to limit what the actual attacks or exfiltration out of your environment will occur to. And if you haven't looked at your firewall logs and what's allowed out before, and you aren't doing a denial default across those logs, it's definitely worth looking, because it can be wild what kind of data actually goes out of your environment if you aren't doing those egress filtering kind of default denials across it. And across, I would say like 95% of the payloads we see, if you were doing that kind of like in-depth least access egress filtering, you'd be able to stop a good amount of those like scan and exploit attacks that are happening across the internet. Now, if you added in that egress detection with WebSocket as well as an attack against the environment, sure, you might be able to poke a hole and get one out. But there are some complexities that come with that, of course. And in general, ensuring that ensuring that the attacker can't get back out to that malicious class is always going to be a lot more sane for you.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice. So here you also say that, you should make sure you can detect Cobalt Strike and TrickBot and other attacker tools. Can you give some tips as to, how someone can go about making sure that whatever tools they have in place can detect those things?
Sure, yeah. So Cobalt Strike and TrickBot and a lot of the loaders all follow fairly similar patterns depending on the process for how they kind of roll through the environment as a sort. Sorry, I was looking at the questions. There are a few ways to go about it as it pertains to Cobalt Strike. Some of them are looking at patterns in the actual base64 data, but generally speaking, instead of trying to look for specific patterns, which you definitely can and should do, you're really better off evaluating right now how the Java process, I should say, is interacting with other processes. Is it the parent process to command? Is it the parent process to PowerShell? Evaluating what's happening in your environment. Otherwise, looking for PowerShell IEX, looking for that kind of invoke web expression being leveraged to load that into memory, to bring that next stager down, to inject and open up memory for the final stage. Those are the kind of areas that you can get kind of good success in detecting Cobalt Strike and the related. But realistically, the attacker has to leverage one of a few different methods, and that part hasn't changed realistically in regard to this exploit class, or this class of exploits. Realistically, they're still going to leverage a similar pattern to get that data in. They're just going to leverage this JNDI exploit to start it as they're kind of like, I'm getting into the environment. I will be able to get into it in this way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. So it looks like we have some questions coming through. We'll give some people some opportunity to ask more questions if they have it, but I'm going to bring up some questions that our attendees have asked so far. So from Chris W., we have the question, do you have any recommendations on configuring Sysmon to monitor WebSocket activity?
Yeah, so you can use Sysmon to do this for sure. Something over here.
And just while Matt is pulling this up, Sysmon is something that we certainly recommend for a lot of our customers. We believe that it does give you a lot more visibility when it comes to your Windows logs, and something that we think really can extend that value of Windows logs and is much easier to use than just like Windows Event Viewer, for example, right?
Yeah, for sure. So in the case of Sysmon, you're going to be wanting to look for likely event ID 3, the network connection. You're going to be looking for localhost essentially and the process that's generated it. You can also do this with the audit, like the network audit connection logs in the 5.1 series as well. What that allows you to do is essentially look for when a process is making a localhost call. It'll likely show up as a ::1, depending on your setup of the environment. You'll take that, and then that you'll essentially leverage that into looking for patterns of connections across it. We do this internally here at Blumira and for our customers here at Blumira to look for when, what's the best way to describe this? To look for when a browser or something like a browser is calling out to that a number of ports locally inside of that environment. So a way to do it would say, when there is a localhost connection with at least 10 ports within that like 5-minute period, you might see something that amounts to port scanning from that environment. That would also detect this pattern as well. The thing that I'll throw out there as just a general warning for that as a whole is that you're going to get a lot of false positives. There are a lot of websites, including government websites, that will trigger that pattern. It is an inevitability that it will happen. It's just kind of the way that I alluded to this previously in regard to host fingerprinting. It's the way that they're doing that host fingerprinting to determine, is this a Windows host? Is this a Linux host? Is this a real host? Is this a bot? And using that kind of WebSocket hook that they're doing, it will also trigger that detection. So you'll have to go through it and do some baselining to say, like, we know that this set of Home Depot is another one that does it. We know that this set of sites will not or cannot be detected on because they will just trigger this as a false positive. But yes, you can use Sysmon network connections. You can use the audit network connections as well, just as much inside of Windows by default without Sysmon, and look at when localhost is making connections to a number of destination ports as it determines from the process ID or process name, depending on your parsing. And you should be able to then get visibility into when this has happened. It's just an open warning that it can be laden with false positives, which is not the most fun thing ever, but it does work.
Thanks for that answer. That was very thorough. So it looks like a couple people are asking for a live demo. That's not necessarily something that we've prepared.
Yeah, I wish I had it set up.
Maybe next time for that one.
I can get a video up for y'all. Sorry about that. I tore down my my main one because I burned the domain in our first post. So I accidentally left the domain in there for everyone. So we'll get something up and going for people and post a video so you can see how this works. But let me explain to you how it does work. And then we can get a video up and going, and so you can see exactly how it works. And I promise it won't be a shady lying video. I promise. So here's how it actually works. So looking at these questions that we have here, it does not require the vulnerable server to be listening for WebSockets. WebSockets do not, like, if you want to like send and receive WebSockets, for sure, you need the server to actually like call back. There's a standard for RFC of WebSockets, that how it's supposed to respond, and the pings and pongs, like there are related things as to how this is supposed to function. The dog pushing into this office, how this is supposed to function, and how like the WebSockets negotiate with themselves. So when you are actually making this call, and when the port scanning happens, whenever this technique is used, there's no expectation that the connection will be successful. And by successful, I mean the WebSocket will open. The connection itself will be successful. Like All it requires is it's an HTTP call, because WebSockets are still just leveraging HTTP. They're not leveraging anything unique. It is still just it's just a different utilization of HTTP that's been built into the browser itself. The RFC for WebSockets doesn't require some alternate method of HTTP. It's still using HTTP 1.1, HTTP 2, however that actual detection is, or that connection is functioning. So the host on the other end will still see that as an HTTP connection. It still sees it as a GET over that actual request. The difference is that WebSocket will never fully open. It will always sit at basically, I think they call it a ready state connecting. At 0 is the state, if I recall correctly, and it will always stay there. It will never close. It will essentially hang open. And that's when you saw some early reports around like resource exhaustion. Like it'll always sit open because the browser is also going to sit it open. So on the browser side, or I should say the server side, sorry. On the server side, it's going to see that as a GET. It's going to see it as a regular HTTP GET. It's going to be able to take the full path, and that path can be as long as a path can be based on the HTTP standard. And it can pass params into it as well. The server does not know if it is a WebSocket call other than the headers inside of it. So you could potentially block all calls to your servers that are from a WebSocket that you aren't expecting a WebSocket call from, for example, because you're going to get that WebSocket header, like that origin, the WebSocket version of WebSocket, upgrade connection. That all comes with that bundle of connection that you're invoking from the WebSocket in the browser. However, the server doesn't know or care. And all the WebSocket on the browser side is doing is saying like, well, I'm waiting for a callback and maybe I'll get one or maybe I won't get one. And it doesn't matter to the actual exploit, especially in this case, nor does it matter for the port scanning if the WebSocket connection completes, because you're not trying to complete a connection. You're not trying to do a full handshake for a WebSocket. All you're trying to do is throw that GET out there or invoke a connection in the case of the port scanning. All you're trying to do is throw it out there, force that server to accept the GET and move on to the next port or get a callback at your actual exploit host. It doesn't require that host to care or know that host is associated with WebSockets, that you're making a WebSocket call. It is not part of the WebSocket standard to define like, this is a WebSocket server, therefore I will only make calls to WebSocket servers. And because WebSockets don't have implicit security and you're expected to impart security upon WebSockets as you create them, there's nothing that stops that WebSocket call from just going. And it allows it to function pretty damn well into my testing. Secure WebSocket, WSS, can get real weird. So HTTPS, WSS doesn't work super well together, but it will allow a connection at times, depending on the browser's cert store, depending on what it's connecting into. But in my testing, like VMware, for example, is real hard to land a good negotiated connection using WSS and HTTPS kind of combined together, for example. But when you're talking about like local non-encrypted traffic, when you're talking about maybe some other kind of HTTPS servers that are more flexible about how they're accepting and negotiating that TLS connection, it does not require anything special. It doesn't require anything on the server that's special. All that it really changes is that WebSocket connection will never succeed. It only matters that GET occurs and hits that server. And that's essentially what that server sees.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. So we've got a couple more questions. Someone says, this alternate trigger is fairly specific to users in a network browsing to a website with malicious JavaScript. Thus, if someone can't browse the internet from an environment, this trigger shouldn't really be an issue, right? Is that correct?
Of course, in the world of defensive security, I think part of us would never like to say, yeah, it's impossible. But yeah, correct. Yeah, if the users is not possible for the user to get to a place where they could potentially load malicious JavaScript, 100%, it likely would not be something that could be exploited across that host. There could be, of course, some unique situations where like an insider threat could invoke that connection, but that is correct. Yeah, any sort of opportunistic watering hole attacks would not fit for that model.
Okay. So someone else asks, if we have implemented 2.16 or the mitigations listed in 2.16, such as removing JNDI class file, can this WebSocket-based attack still be used to perform RCE?
In my testing, no, it cannot be performed for RCE. I tested with 2.16. That was where we wrapped up things with CERT. That 2.16 did fix this issue. We weren't able to invoke an RCE. There might still be an issue with DOS, of course, as it pertains to that infinite recursion that was added in 2.16. However, if you're removing class files, a lot of that solves a lot of those problems anyways. So no, 2.16, you're good. There's some obviously extenuating circumstances with 2.16 that we all know about now. So when you can get to 2.17, do. But if you're on 2.16, you're in a good place as it pertains to this attack model at the very least.
Okay, well, that should be a relief for hopefully some of our attendees to hear that. Someone else asked, how should we handle an application like Crystal Reports that uses Log4j? Do we need to wait for SAP to release an update, or is this something we can update ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't used Crystal Reports in a number of years, which I'm partially thankfully about, but not thankful about right now because I'd love to give you better details on this. If I recall correctly, Crystal Reports management server is the only thing listing at 6,400. If the local clients aren't listening, so one of the things that I want to make sure we talk about, this requires the local client to be listening somewhere. Like there requires that local host, or it requires the attacker to know like where to, or they could span. I mean, technically you could throw it across the entire private network space, but that takes a very long time. And unless you're sitting on that site for like hours, you're probably not going to be able to spam the entire private network space with JNDI exploit strings. It's possible, of course, and from a threat modeling perspective, it's worth talking about, but it's unlikely. I don't think local Crystal Reports is likely at risk. However, it's a damn good question. I should set one up to find out. I think you're probably okay to wait for SAP to release an update in that situation, because I'm pretty sure the management server is the listening, and then the clients connect up to it. If someone has any other specific thoughts on that, by all means, drop into chat. I'm happy to give some more details on that. I'll have to do some setting up to see, because I'm pretty sure the ODBC connection goes over 6,400. So you have to know where that management server is and make sure that is being validated properly. But you should be okay. What I would do is say, make sure that your management server, that's where the ODBC connections are going back for your Crystal report, make sure you have some tight egress filtering on that. And then make sure you're monitoring any sort of Log4j input and output as it pertains to that machine. You should be okay to wait for releases, kind of like compensating controls across that environment.
Thanks, Matt. Looks like we have someone asking for you to explain the POC in your blog, which I believe we alluded to earlier in this webinar, but maybe it's worth going through one more time just to make sure everyone does understand that POC. Sure.
Yeah, so the POC in the blog, which we can get a video up this week for, was on JMD. What version of Log4j was that? I think it was 2.13 at that point this was built with. It was a Spring Framework REST API. So a fairly straightforward Spring REST API. In the way that this was set up, it was logging out debug info, all basically the requests that were coming. It's a common developer pattern where you're developing an API, you have it in debug mode, you have it in non-production mode, and you're just logging out those requests because you want to see what the origin is, you want to see what the params were, you want to see what the password, you want to have information as it pertains to what's happening across that environment. And the POC that was built essentially took that idea that we have this framework for Spring. We have a REST API we're developing locally. We're going to spin that up on port 8080, not insane, not a permissioned port inside the environment. And then we're going to have that person go over to a website. And it was just a website. I mean, I could say the domain name now because I already burned it. It was abcxss.com. It was just a regular website out on the internet. And when they brought up that web page, on load of the web page, it would then spawn a function that connected to some specific WebSockets. Those WebSockets then would attempt to connect locally to the port 8080, and it would then spam it with a number of different paths. So in this situation, I did a /login username that you see right there, and the username was the param. That was actually the param that was loading that malicious class in that situation, out to a different server for this test itself. And that allowed a situation where this host that was just running a Spring framework, it was just logging out the information as it pertains to what's happening in this get. And when the WebSocket connected to the host, it completed the get request because it's just firing that get out and then waiting for that response. It's not doing like this in-depth negotiation. And the moment that that get hits this POC server, it logs it out. And when it logs it out, it invokes that connection. I used RMI, as you can see there. RMI has been better in my testing. It logged out, it went out through RMI with a custom port that you see there, 12345. It pulled down the malicious class, and then it executed on that host itself. To be able to, in this situation, I was using command to pivot to another process. It's pretty straightforward. Like I said, it doesn't require negotiation of connection necessarily for that WebSocket. It's just firing out that HTTP GET because that's how WebSocket starts. And it was hitting the Spring Framework REST API that was logging out the path as well as the params for, in this case, the login. But it could be anything, doesn't matter. An origin, like I said, is also manipulatable. And the moment that Log4j logs out that information, it then results in exploitation of that vulnerability. And as we said, we did test the 216 and 217. In this situation, it resolves it.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you so much for that explanation. I think that's really helpful. I know that I do see in the Q&A where people are hoping for a live POC. We'll try to work on that and get that over to folks so you can have hopefully a clear explanation of what this POC entails, and hopefully Matt's verbal explanation helped as well. In the meantime, I don't see any other questions. I know we wanted to provide a lot of education here. This isn't a webinar to sell Blumira, but I do think it's worth just telling a little bit about what we do. Matt, if you want to just quickly share that for our attendees.
Sure. So here at Blumira, we are a log aggregator and threat detection platform. We pull in data for organizations of really any size. We focus heavily on SMBs, but really all organizations. And what we do a lot is focus on reducing noise through detecting threatening behaviors and less kind of just hoping that we'll be able to find the bad thing ad hoc. We do that through looking through behavioral detections. We do that through ensuring that people get what they need out of their data. And part of what we do is also, as you heard Erica talking about, is push people to expand their data sets really widely across their environments. Because we are a scalable SIM, we don't do it based on data. We do it based off the size of your organization. So in those situations where you haven't set up Sysmon before, you haven't set up audit logs before, you haven't been able to do that because you just would cost too much. Blumira is different because what we do is we push people to say, hey, give us everything you can give us, and we will ensure that you are safe, and here's how we will do it. And we do that through behavioral detection and kind of what I was saying, ensuring that you can get the information you need out of your data through reporting, through detection that's relevant to you in a way that's scalable, efficient, and cost conscious. Sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, Matt, for answering all these questions. I know we kind of put you on the spot here. I think you handled it very well, and we really appreciate your thorough explanations and your patience. So thank you to all of you for your questions as well, and for your engagement throughout this webinar. I know that there are a lot of questions surrounding this new discovery, and we're happy to work with you to make sure that you have all of the information that you need. So feel free to contact us. Go to www.blumira.com. We're happy to hear from you. And also keep an eye out on our future webinars. We've got one coming up on January 13th about how to improve your cybersecurity posture on a budget. So look forward to that. And we hope that you join us next time. Thank you so much for joining us this Monday. I hope you have a happy holiday season. And Matt, thank you again so much for joining us.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.